things to look for in yourself and others who you care about are changes in behavior. Are people spending a lot more time, for example, in front of a particular screen or using a particular app? Um, Emotion dysregulation. Are people more irritable? Do they seem aloof? Also, things to look for would be more isolation, social isolation. The classic kid locking themselves in the bedroom for many hours and not coming out. Those are really important signals that something may be going on in children and in adults. The other thing that I think is really important for people to keep in mind are risk factors. We're all susceptible and vulnerable to forming habits that are unhealthy and developing depression, anxiety. There's no question about that. Um, but we know from a mental health perspective that people who have ADHD or already have an anxiety disorder or already have PTSD or already have an eating disorder are going to be even more susceptible to the impact of these technologies and these applications. And so parents and friends of people who, really want to support others need to be aware that some people are just going to be at higher risk than others. I would start with reducing or stopping what I call media multitasking. And that is having your phone and doing something else, or having two screens, watching Netflix and being on social media. Really try to focus on serial monotasking and doing one thing at a time, whether that's when you're relaxing and viewing entertainment or when you're at work on a video conference and looking at your email when someone is talking. Really try to focus on monotasking. I think would be step number one. I think step number two is to take a real break, which is exercise or going for a walk in nature or socialization or meditation without technology. I think is really sort of key. When I like to run, and when I go for a run, I only bring my watch. I don't bring any technology because that's my sort of alone time. Another example is taking a sort of social media Sabbath or a technology free day. So a lot of people are embracing like Saturday is the day where I'm not gonna be on a screen, and really give yourself a chance to recharge. And then finally, and I think critically, is getting technology out of the bedroom, right? Sleep is so important for our brain. And we know that people who have trouble sleeping are at higher risk for all kinds of mental health issues and dementia. So, getting the phone out of the bedroom, reading a book before we go to bed that's made of paper. These are things that we can do right away to have an impact on our brain and really create some resiliency. So one of the biggest challenges of rewiring your brain is changing habits. Habits are very hard to change, particularly well ingrained habits or habits that are on the verge of becoming an addiction. And this is where we can look to the addiction literature for some ideas. So one idea that comes out of the addiction literature is to set a quit date. Typically around like a holiday or a birthday or New Year's, say, all right, this is the day I'm going to really change my behavior. We know that setting a date, particularly a quit date, can be very powerful. The second idea that comes from the addiction literature is having what's called a commitment coach. Having a friend or a buddy or a parent or a therapist who really can hold you accountable to the goals you set and who you can check in with on a regular basis is also very important. The other important thing we know from the addiction literature is to come up with tricks that help us think about the future. What do I mean by that? We know that people with severe addiction have what's called a foreshortened view of the future. They don't look into the future because they don't think they have one. They're so focused on the present. So having photographs of loved ones or planning a vacation or a reward for yourself if you're able to accomplish certain goals over a certain period of time can also be a powerful motivator. So Predictably Human is a uh, biological life sciences company that is using digital technologies to help with addiction, right? So I got inspired writing the book that we want technologies that serve humans rather than break us down, and co-founded this company that uses a smart aerosolization device. You can think of it as like a vaping device for FDA approved medications, that it also has a cellular card in it connected to the internet and a data analytics play and an app. And this creates a very nice platform for treating people with addiction. So we're starting with nicotine use disorder. We also have grants at the NIH for opioid use disorder. We're in discussions with the NIH about cannabis use disorder. And there are a variety of other applications as well. But the idea of being able to control the dose with a digital device that you basically inhale, and that goes into your lungs, and the medication disperses through your lungs, and then have that connected to an app and a clinician can create an ecosystem of 24/7 support for people with addiction. If we look at just nicotine use disorder, we're talking about transitioning people from lit end cigarettes to essentially a smart vaping device, and then doing a 6-month taper where we're very slowly tapering the medication over time. Now, the problem with today's intervention is they're very fixed. They don't adapt. And they tend not to be highly personalized. What we can do with this platform is personalize the settings to each individual's type and pattern of use and their addiction, and have it adapt over time. We know that life happens, stress happens, the dog dies, or somebody gets sick, or something happens at work. And those are really hard times to stay on the path. And we allow people to adjust that taper schedule in the face of challenging events. Another example would be with opiate use disorder. We're using our platform to do what's called induction. Induction is when you're taking people off of an illicit opioid like fentanyl or heroin or pain pills, and then putting them on a medication called buprenorphine, which satisfies the craving for those opiates without the euphoric effects, and is a very effective medication, but does it through an aerosol and does it in a way that's safe and doesn't require an inpatient or outpatient visit. We can do it remotely. And so the plan there is to expand access to what we know is a life-saving medication in buprenorphine to potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who can't access high-quality care and get their addiction treated. I think there are two sides to the AI story, just like there's two sides to every technology, right? There are healthy uses and unhealthy uses. I think on the healthy side, what I'm seeing as a psychiatrist and someone who's in the mental health world with a variety of companies that I'm advising or co-founding, is the ability to make humans more efficient. And I really emphasize having a human in the loop for all of these early applications in particular is critical because they can go off the rails so quickly. You also have to understand what was the data or what was the model trained on. The old saying, garbage in, garbage out. And one of the problems with ChatGPT and Gemini, which were trained on all of the internet, it's got the good and the bad in there. So particularly for healthcare applications, you really need to understand, who created the model and what was the data that's underlying it to make it better. But making human clinicians more efficient, giving them more job satisfaction, getting better outcomes for their patients, which is very rewarding, is really the key because we know that there's a supply and demand mismatch and a gap in the number of mental health clinicians that we have and the number of people who need help. I think one of the big risks, particularly with AI and brain disorders and mental health disorders, is using models that were not trained specifically to deliver, for example, psychotherapy for that task. And we now know that many young people, adults too, I have friends included, who are using ChatGPT as a therapist. And while I have seen some very excellent recommendations from the large language models trained on the internet, we know there are multiple case reports of people, for example, who are suicidal, getting recommendations on how to complete a suicide. We know that there are reports of young women with eating disorders getting advice on how to be more anorexic. We know there are examples of people who are paranoid having the large language model feed that paranoia. So again, we need to be aware of the source of the model, the application of that model, and also who's using it and what risk factors do they have.